The ballroom lights were blinding, bouncing off crystal chandeliers and a sea of sequined gowns. 100 faces turned toward me as if I'd stepped onto the wrong stage of someone else's life. Cameras flicked open like metallic wings. The click, click, click of shutters echoed across the room. I stood frozen in my simple navy dress, hands trembling at my sides, trying to breathe through the thick weight of attention that had never belonged to me. And then my father, Richard Carter, the billionaire who had spent my whole childhood pretending I wasn't there, rested a hand on my shoulder. His voice carried across the microphone steady and polished. "This is Sophie Carter," he announced. "My daughter." A sharp gasp erupted somewhere near the front row. My stepmother stiffened like she'd swallowed ice. Liam watched me from his wheelchair, eyes shining with something fragile and hopeful. But my own pulse hammered a warning in my ears. I wasn't meant to stand here. I wasn't meant to be seen. Not by this family. Not by this world. Yet here I was, dragged into the spotlight of a life that had always pushed me aside. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. I wasn't always the woman standing in front of cameras drowning in sudden attention. Most days I was just Sophie, 24, tired from double shifts at a Brooklyn cafe, living in a tiny one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. I worked for every dollar I earned, even though my father's money filtered into my bank account once a month like a silent reminder that I came from a world that didn't want me. I grew up the quiet shadow of Richard Carter's past. My mother raised me alone, never once bitter, never once feeding me the anger I probably had a right to feel. She died when I was 18, and after that my father stepped in with financial support, but nothing else. No warmth, no phone calls, nothing that resembled love. Meanwhile, the family he built after me lived like royalty. Elaine, his wife, glided through charity galas with her perfectly curated sons by her side. Their faces were plastered on magazine covers, framed along the staircase of the Carter estate, spotlighted in every glossy holiday card. Mine was never included, not even once. Growing up, I learned to make myself small. I learned to keep distance. I learned how to survive without the people who were supposed to protect me. But the strange thing about being forgotten is that you start building a life no one else can touch. For me, that life became Bright Horizons, a small community center. Jasmine and I scraped together from donated mats and chipped paint, a place where kids with disabilities could learn to move and dance and laugh without fear. No reporters, no boardrooms, no billionaires, just kids fighting for their own small victories, and for a long time that was enough. But everything shifted the night I saw the headline scroll across Jasmine's phone: Carter heir injured in crash, family requests, privacy. The room around me blurred. My hands went cold. Liam, my 10-year-old half-brother, had always been the gentle one, the one who smiled shyly at the Christmas cookie I once gave him, the only person in that family who ever looked at me without confusion or discomfort. And now he was hurt. Permanent injury, wheelchair, a life changed forever. I tried to tell myself it wasn't my place to feel something. I tried to stay focused on cleaning up the mats in our center, tried to pretend that headline wasn't pulling at something raw inside me. But no matter how hard I pushed it down, one truth kept rising to the surface. Liam was just a kid, a scared kid, and if his world was anything like mine had been, he might be feeling more alone than anyone realized. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the Carter estate for the first time in years. The iron gates glinted under the winter sun, tall and imposing, just like when I was a child waiting on the outside. Back then, I used to hope someone inside would remember me. Now I hoped they wouldn't, but they let me in. For once, they wanted something I could give. Inside, the marble floors gleamed like nothing bad could ever happen here. Voices rose down the hall, sharp, panicked, angry. When I stepped into the doorway, I saw Richard with his shoulders slumped and Elaine pacing like a woman trying to outrun fate. They didn't see me at first, but when they did, Elaine's expression hardened instantly. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, as if my presence contaminated the air. I almost left. I almost let her words push me back into the quiet life I'd built. But then I heard a small voice behind me. "You're Sophie, right?" I turned and found Liam watching me from his wheelchair, pale and trembling, but hopeful. "You're my sister," he whispered. And in that moment, the world shifted in a way I couldn't walk away from. I knelt beside him, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yeah," I murmured. "I'm your sister." He hesitated, then asked the question that would change everything. "Can you show me the place where you work? The place with the kids who dance." Behind me. Elaine was already gearing up to shut the idea down, but for the first time in my life, someone in that family looked at me like I mattered, and I wasn't about to let him down. What happened when I brought Liam into my world? That's where the real story begins. I was 8 years old, the night I stood on the far edge of the Carter family's Christmas party, clutching a small wrapped present in both hands. My dress shoes pinched, my curls had frizzed in the cold, and nobody had noticed me slip in through the back door with my mother. Laughter rang out from the living room, big, bright, effortless. Children I didn't know raced past me, red ribbons flying behind them. When I stepped forward trying to catch someone's eye, Elaine glanced over her shoulder and said sharply, "Sweetheart, don't stand there. You'll ruin the pictures." My mother's hand tightened around mine, her smile wobbling as she guided me back toward the hallway. Through a doorway, I saw Richard lifting his sons, my half-brothers, onto a stool so the photographer could get a better angle. One boy wore a green sweater with tiny reindeers stitched across the front. The other held a toy train still in its box. They were laughing the kind of laugh that fills a room and claims it. I held my tiny gift closer, waiting for someone to say, "Sophie, come here," but no one did. The photographer called for the Carters, just the Carters, and my mother's shoulders sagged in a way I didn't understand then, but never forgot. Before the picture snapped, someone bumped into me. My present slipped landing with a soft thud. The sound barely registered in that bright, glittering room, but to me, it echoed. I remember bending to pick it up, blinking away the sting in my eyes, telling myself not to cry, not here, not in front of them. No one even looked my way. Looking back, I think that was the first time I understood what it meant to be part of a family, but never truly inside it. Years later, that memory still has weight. It rises in moments I don't expect, like when Liam took my hand outside the mansion, or when Elaine's voice sharpened against my presence. It reminds me how long this quiet ache has lived in me. For as long as I can remember, I'd been learning to survive in the middle of two worlds. My mother's world was small but warm, held together by love and thrift store finds and late-night cocoa when rain drummed against the windows. In her world, I wasn't the other daughter. I was just Sophie. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, but somehow she always had time to sit with me during homework or brush my hair before school. My father's world, well, that felt like a place built out of glass. Beautiful, polished, but cold enough to bite. I visited, rarely always escorted by a driver who spoke to me in polite half-smiles. I never knew where to stand, what to say, or whether I was allowed to touch anything. Everything smelled like lemon polish and wealth. Everything echoed. And nobody except Liam, when he was little, even seemed to know I was there. As a child, I always thought it was something about me, something wrong, something missing. I watched my half-brothers with their shiny bikes and designer jackets, their photos lined up along the staircase, each one capturing a moment of belonging. I learned how to step quietly, speak gently, make myself smaller, because whenever I tried to claim space, I felt the invisible pushback. Sometimes it came from Elaine's cool smile, the way she'd greet me with a voice too sweet and eyes too sharp. Sometimes it came from Richard's distracted nod, already turning away before I finished a sentence. Sometimes it came from silence, long stretches of silence, after birthdays, holidays, milestones. Silence that stretched for months. By the time I was 12, I'd mastered the art of staying out of the way. I didn't ask for invites to events. I didn't mention school achievements. I stopped bringing little handmade gifts to the house. Every small disappointment carved its mark, and I grew used to tucking them away quietly, keeping them where they wouldn't show. My mother told me again and again, your worth isn't measured by their attention. But children believe what they feel, not what they're told. I felt forgettable, replaceable, like an afterthought in someone else's neatly arranged life. When high school rolled around, the differences grew sharper. My father's sons wore brand new sneakers and carried the latest phones. I wore what my mother and I could piece together from consignment shops. They spent weekends at the family's lake house. I spent mine working at a local diner to save for college. I would sometimes see photos online, my father on a sailboat, his arm around Elaine, the boys, beaming with windblown hair and sunburned noses. I was never invited. Not once. There were times I tried to reach out. I called Richard one year to tell him I'd made honor roll. His assistant answered and said he was in a meeting. He never called back. Another year I showed up at the estate on my own, hoping to surprise him for Father's Day. The guard told me politely that I wasn't on the visitor list. That one hurt more than I let on. I remember walking home, the heat rising off the pavement, thinking, maybe I don't belong anywhere. Maybe that's just how things are for me. When my mother died of cancer my senior year, the loss hollowed me out. The world collapsed into hospital rooms and paperwork, and when it was finally over, the silence was unbearable. Richard attended the funeral, standing stiff in the back row, offering a handshake instead of a hug. He asked if I needed anything. I told him I'd be fine. He wired money the next week. No message attached, no visit, no shared grief, just help from a distance like always. After that, I couldn't stomach the idea of living under his roof, even though he offered. So he paid for my apartment and college tuition, but every dollar felt like a reminder that I wasn't meant to step into his world. I became the daughter hidden in the margins, taken care of, financially ignored, emotionally. The strange thing is, you can get used to almost anything. I learned to accept the distance. I learned to exist in the spaces between other people's lives. The hurt didn't fade. It simply became familiar. Maybe that's why I poured so much of myself into helping kids who felt overlooked. Maybe that's why Jasmine and I built our community center from scraps and willpower. In that space, people mattered. Their names mattered. Their progress mattered. Their laughter wasn't something that faded into the background the moment a camera panned away. Maybe I was trying to build the place I needed as a child. But the past has a way of shaping the paths we walk long after we think we've moved on. When Liam came into my life again, this time fragile, frightened, and unsure, I felt a crack in the armor I'd spent years building. I saw in him a version of myself, a child standing on the outside, looking in, desperate for someone to reach out a hand and say, "I see you." And maybe deep down I wanted to be that person for him. Maybe I wanted to rewrite the story that had shaped me. I remember standing at the center's doorway the day I brought Liam for the first time. The winter air nipped at our faces, and his small hands trembled around the wheels of his chair. Inside, kids moved to soft music, some laughing, some determined. It was the world I'd built piece by piece, a world full of imperfections, but also warmth. Liam looked up at me, eyes wide with nerves. "Are you sure it's okay?" "I'm here," he asked. And something inside me twisted the old wound of never feeling welcome anywhere. "Yes," I whispered. "It's more than okay." He rolled in slowly, almost cautiously, and I watched as he took in the mismatched chairs, the scuffed floor, the artwork taped crookedly to the walls. I wondered what this space looked like to a child raised in privilege, surrounded by marble floors and staff who polished every surface to a shine. But then something shifted. A girl in braces waved at him. A boy in a wheelchair spun past with a grin, and slowly the fear in Liam's eyes eased. Watching him try, laugh, and stumble reminded me of the way I used to hope for someone to pull me forward, to show me that I had a place, even if it wasn't with the people who should have been my family. All the ways I'd been overlooked, dismissed, forgotten, they didn't disappear. They sat quietly in my memory, shaping how I approached him, how I listened, how I made space for him. Past pain isn't something you shed. It becomes part of how you move in the world. Those old hurts surfaced one afternoon when I stepped outside the center and found Elaine waiting by the curb, expression tight coat, immaculate eyes, cold as winter glass. She looked around the worn neighborhood like she was afraid the ground itself might stain her shoes. "We need to talk," she said, her tone clipped, as if I were an employee who'd crossed a boundary. In that moment, I felt 8 years old again, standing at the edge of a room I wasn't supposed to enter. But this time, something in me resisted. I wasn't a child anymore. I wasn't the girl holding a forgotten gift in a crowded house. Still as she spoke, belittling the work I did, insisting Liam didn't need me, I felt the familiar ache of being dismissed. The old instinct to bow my head and back away crept in the urge to disappear before someone reminded me I didn't belong. But when she finished, I steadied my breath and said quietly, "Liam chooses to be here, and you don't get to decide I'm unnecessary." Even as the words left my mouth, I felt the weight of years behind them, years of swallowing hurt, of being told without words that my presence was inconvenient. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't push, I just refused to shrink, for the first time. That was the moment I sensed something shifting, not just around me, but inside me. Something old was beginning to unravel. Something deeper was rising to the surface. What I didn't know then was that the past wasn't finished with me. It was about to open in a way I never expected, revealing the truth I had spent my whole life quietly surviving. A thin crack of light slipped under the study door as I passed, carrying Liam's backpack after a late session at the center. The house was quiet unnaturally, so the kind of quiet that comes when people are too tired to pretend anymore. I reached for the light switch, but before I could touch it, I heard my father's voice, low, strained, nothing like the polished tone he used in public. "You know why she can't find out," he said. My hand froze. Papers rustled. Elaine's voice answered, clipped and sharp. "Richard, this is spiraling. You shouldn't have brought her into this in the first place." I leaned closer, the door cold beneath my palm. "She was never supposed to be part of the family's public narrative," Elaine hissed. "That was the agreement." My breath stopped. Then my name, my full name spoken like a problem. "Sophie cannot know what we've been doing with the foundation money. Not now." A drawer slammed and a folder slid across the desk. I didn't mean to push the door open. I didn't mean to step inside. But I did. For a moment, the three of us froze me in the doorway, them standing over a spread of files and financial statements that glowed beneath the desk lamp like an accusation. I wish I could say I didn't understand what I was seeing. I wish I could claim ignorance or innocence, but something in me recognized the truth even before they spoke. It hit with a force I didn't expect. My father's face shifted, the shock settling into something weary and resigned. Elaine's tightened into the familiar mask she used whenever she wanted me gone. And in that moment, the air in the study felt like a different kind of battlefield. I didn't know it then, but everything in my world had just changed. Shock has a strange way of slowing time down. The moment stretched and warped as my father reached for the papers, as Elaine stiffened like a cornered animal. And I, standing there with Liam's backpack still slung over my arm, felt the ground shift beneath me. I've faced indifference my whole life, but betrayal is different. Betrayal has a weight. It hums under your skin like electricity, sharp and unmistakable. They didn't speak at first. Maybe they hoped I hadn't seen the numbers. Maybe they hoped I would back out of the room like a child intruding on adult business. I didn't move. Eventually, my father cleared his throat. "This isn't what you think, Sophie." But I already knew it was exactly what I thought. The folder nearest to me was stamped with the Turner Foundation, an organization I'd been asked, begged even, to help reshape. Underneath that header were allocations for community programs, except the amounts didn't match anything we actually received at the center. They were inflated, sometimes doubled, sometimes tripled. Money supposedly earmarked for the Bright Horizons programs had never reached us. It had gone somewhere else, somewhere inside this house. My father tried again. "This is complicated." "Then explain it," I said, but my voice came out flatter than I expected. Elaine stepped forward, pressing her manicured hand against the table as though guarding the documents. "You shouldn't be snooping through private matters." "I wasn't snooping," I said. "You left the door open. That doesn't give you the right to barge in." My father's sigh cut through the tension, but it didn't soften anything. "Elaine, please." He turned to me, and for once there was something vulnerable in his eyes, something human. "We never intended to deceive you," he said quietly. The room felt colder at that. "Never intended." Words that always meant the opposite. My gaze drifted over the papers again. I'd spent years building the community center with my own hands, scraping together grant applications, holding fundraisers, watching Jasmine grow circles under her eyes as we tried to keep the lights on. Meanwhile, an organization worth millions had used our name like a glossy sticker on a box full of empty promises. My father must have seen the realization harden across my face because his voice faltered. "We redirected funds temporarily," he said. "Just until the family's new projects were stable." Elaine added sharply, "We're not criminals, Sophie. It's standard practice. The public doesn't need to know everything." But I wasn't listening to her. I was looking at the signatures, my father's, Elaine's, and my stomach twisted, dates that went back years. This had been happening long before Liam's accident, long before my involvement, long before they ever thought to speak my name in public. I closed my eyes for a moment, grounding myself against the surge of anger rising like a tide. All those months we struggled to pay rent at the center. All those nights Jasmine and I sat at a kitchen table staring at overdue invoices. All those times we told the parents, "We'll make it work somehow," even when we weren't sure we could. And all along, the money they claimed to be giving us, the money they touted in interviews and glossy brochures, was being funneled into private events, expansions to the mansion, and charitable galas that served no one but their own image. It made sense now. The photo ops, the sudden interest in Liam's progress, the eagerness to present me as the family's hidden gem. I wasn't being honored. I was being used. A convenient face, a heartfelt story, a shield to cover years of misappropriation. My throat tightened, heat spreading up my neck. "You lied," I whispered. My father swallowed. "I made decisions." "You lied," I repeated, not louder, just clearer. Elaine straightened her voice, becoming brittle. "Watch your tone." I met her gaze, unblinking. "No." The word felt like a door unlocking inside me. She stepped back, surprised, and for the first time in a long time I felt something shift. Something old and heavy began to loosen in my chest. My father rubbed his forehead as if trying to ease a migraine. "Sophie, I know this looks bad." "It is bad." His jaw tightened at that. "You don't understand the pressures I'm under." "No," I said slowly. "I understand them better than you think. I understand that you've been letting the world believe you were supporting the community while you were quietly supporting your image. I understand that you put my name on things you never intended to fund. And I understand that Liam wasn't the only one who needed help." He looked up sharply. "What do you mean? I mean you needed a good story," I said. "And I was the easiest one to use." Elaine scoffed. "Don't make this about you." "It is about me," I said. "It's been about me for years." The room went still again, and then everything clicked at once. Why I was suddenly invited to galas, why my father asked me to stand beside him, why the cameras turned toward me like I was part of the narrative, why they finally acknowledged my existence. They were preparing for scrutiny, maybe even an investigation. They needed a face the public would empathize with, a daughter who had seemingly been embraced, a disabled child whose progress could be credited to their generosity. I was the cover story. Liam was the miracle. And the community center was the evidence. It was all so clear it hurt. My father stepped toward me, his voice low. "Sophie, please don't do anything rash." I stared at him, a dozen memories flashing through my mind, memories of trying to be seen, trying to be heard, trying to be part of a family that never wanted me. And suddenly I wasn't the girl waiting at the edge of family photos anymore. I was a woman staring at the truth. "You should have thought about that," I said softly, "before you built a legacy on lies." Elaine opened her mouth, but my father lifted a hand to stop her. His eyes dropped to the desk, the papers between us like a line he could no longer pretend wasn't there. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew this moment was the turning point, the point where the past could no longer be ignored, the point where the truth demanded something of me. I picked up the folder, the weight of it strangely grounding. "I'm taking this," I said. Elaine sputtered. "You can't. I can," I said, "and I am." My father looked at me, then not as a daughter he'd ignored, not as a problem he'd hoped would fade, but as someone who finally saw the whole picture. "Sophie," he whispered, "please think about what you're doing." "I have," I said. And I walked out of the study. The corridor felt different beneath my feet, as if I were walking through the house for the first time instead of the 100th. I passed the framed photos of the Carter family, The perfect smiles, the curated happiness, and felt none of the old ache. Something had shifted inside me, something irreversible. When I stepped outside, the cold night air hit my face, sharp and bracing. I drew in a deep breath, clutching the folder to my chest. The truth was mine now, and I wasn't going to stay silent, not anymore. What I chose to do next would expose everything: the lies, the omissions, the money that never reached the children who needed it. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I felt ready. What happened at the confrontation that followed, that was a moment no one in the Carter family would ever forget. The room went silent the moment I laid the folder on the long mahogany table. Crystal glasses stopped mid-air, forks hovered above half-eaten plates, and every face turned toward me with a mixture of confusion and unease. Richard sat at the head of the table, stiffening as the papers slid toward him. Elaine froze beside him, fingers tightening around her wine glass until it trembled. I didn't wait. I opened the folder wide enough for the whole dinner party to see. Pages spread out financial statements, diverted fund logs, identical signatures printed in perfect mechanical strokes. "You've all been celebrating the Turner Foundation tonight," I said, my voice clear, steady. "But you should know what you're really raising your glasses to." Chairs scraped back. Murmurs rippled through the room. I lifted the top page between my fingers and let it fall onto the table. "That I added quietly is a lie." Elaine shot up from her seat. "Sophie, don't you dare! But it was too late." Cameras turned, guests leaned forward, and my father's face drained of color under the bright chandelier. I wish I could tell you this moment came out of nowhere, but the truth is, everything had been building to this. That evening had been billed as a celebration, a formal dinner to unveil the Foundation's new era of transparency and outreach. I could feel the irony burning under my skin as I watched the servers glide between tables and listened to Richard charm his guests with polished, practiced ease. I waited for the glasses to be filled, for the toasts to begin, for the moment when he stood up with Elaine beside him to brag about the millions supposedly funneled into community programs. Waited for him to use my name again. Waited for the lie to stretch its wings across the room. In my purse, the folder felt heavier than any policy file or grant paperwork I'd carried before. It wasn't just evidence, it was everything they hoped no one would see. Jasmine had offered to stand by me, but I told her no. This was my confrontation, my wound, my reckoning. I arrived early, sat quietly near the middle of the long table, and held myself steady as people around me marveled at the lavish decor, the imported flowers, the polished silverware. All of it bought with money meant for children who needed therapy mats and mobility aids. I thought about those kids all night. It kept my resolve firm. When Richard raised his glass for the final toast, the one that would cement the illusion, I stood, and the room froze around me. The moment I finished dropping the first piece of evidence, I saw something flicker across my father's face: fear, guilt, recognition. Something old and exhausted. Elaine recovered first. She always did. Everyone, she said with a strained laugh, "Sophie seems to be confused about confused." I cut in, turning toward her. "Then explain why money allocated for adaptive dance equipment never reached our center. Explain why your signature—" I lifted another page, appears on forms filed months before you claimed you'd even reviewed them. Richard rubbed his temples, but Elaine stepped forward, her voice rising. "Sophie, you are embarrassing yourself. These are internal documents you don't understand." The guests watched me, waiting, curious, unsettled. "Then let's show them one they will understand," I said. I pulled out the final page, the one I hadn't dared read twice because of what it meant. A reimbursement request, filed under my name. My forged signature printed clearly at the bottom. I held it up, watching the room sharpen as people squinted to see it. "This," I said, "claims I requested a personal stipend from the Foundation, $10,000, a stipend I never received, never asked for, and never even knew existed." Gasps broke out. A reporter at the far end of the table sat up straighter. Elaine's face went wax white. "That isn't real," she whispered. "It's real," I said. "And it's illegal." Richard swallowed hard, shaking his head slowly, like he'd only just now seen the trap he'd walked into. "Elaine," he murmured. She stepped back, eyes darting, calculating. "Richard, don't you dare!" "You forged her name," he said, the words barely more than breath. A murmur spread like wildfire through the guests. Someone stood. Another reached for their phone. The weight in the room shifted completely, tipping away from the people who had always controlled it. Elaine let out a shaky laugh. "Richard, be serious. Why would I forge anything?" "Because it wasn't just my name," I said. "There are 6 others, small amounts spread out, enough to muddy the books without anyone noticing, enough to use my connection to the center as justification." Her eyes snapped to me, sharp and venomous. "You think you're so self-righteous?" "What I think," I said, stepping toward her, "is that you used my name for convenience. You used my story for sympathy. And you used Liam's recovery for publicity." At that, the room erupted, voices rising, anger swelling, questions flying like sparks. Elaine's mask cracked. She turned to my father, panic in her voice. "Tell them she's lying." Richard didn't speak. He didn't even look at her. His gaze stayed on the paper in his hand, the one with my forged signature. His lips parted with a kind of stunned disbelief. "Elaine," he whispered, "what did you do?" The silence that followed was worse than any yelling could have been. Elaine's breath hitched, her fingers twitching. "I did what I had to do," she finally said. "You think your daughter deserves this spotlight? You think she earned it? She's nothing but a charity project with a sad childhood and a center held together with duct tape. You needed something real, something polished. I made sure you had it." The gasp that rolled through the room felt physical, like a wave hitting the walls. Even the servers stopped moving. My father stared at her, stunned. "You crossed lines we cannot repair." Elaine's voice cracked under the pressure. "I built this family's public image. I protected it. I did what you never had the stomach to do." "No," he said softly. "You tore it apart." Liam, sitting at the far end beside one of the staff members, stared wide-eyed and frightened. When I saw him flinch at his mother's voice, something inside me tightened painfully. "I won't let her ruin us." Elaine spat, turning toward me again. "She doesn't belong here. She never has." I straightened. "Maybe not in your version of this family, but that ends tonight." I reached for Richard's glass, the one he'd used to toast his own carefully maintained image, and tapped it gently with a fork until the room quieted again. "This isn't about a seat at your table," I said. "This is about the truth. And I won't let you use my name or Liam's progress or the children at my center to keep lying." The guests listened, rapt. A few nodded. One woman wiped a tear. Someone whispered, "She's right." The tide had turned, and Elaine felt it. She lunged forward, suddenly desperate. "Richard, do something." But he didn't. He simply exhaled a long, heavy sound and lowered his eyes. "Sophie," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. Not even close." But it was the first honest thing he'd said in years. Elaine stared at him, horror washing across her face as she realized she'd lost him. Lost the room. Lost the narrative she'd spent years crafting. "This isn't over," she said through clenched teeth. "It is," I replied gently. "You just don't want to see it." Her heel wobbled as she stepped back, bumping into a chair. Someone rose to steady her, but she shrugged them off and hurried from the room, fleeing under hundreds of watching eyes. When the door slammed behind her, no one moved. Then slowly, the balance shifted. Reporters approached me. Donors asked questions. A few guests even touched my arm, quietly offering support. But I didn't stay long. I looked at Liam's sweet shaking, unsure then back at my father, whose entire world now rested in a pile of documents on a table. "You knew some of it," I said softly. "You just didn't want to see the rest." His eyes shimmered with shame. "I didn't want to lose everything." "You already did," I said. "You just didn't realize it." I turned away from him, from the whispers, from the cameras, from the glittering room that had once felt impenetrable. I slipped out into the hallway, the air cooler, quieter, easier to breathe. Behind me, the room remained in stunned silence, the legacy of the Carter name cracked wide open. And I walked away knowing that this time I wasn't leaving in shame. I was leaving in truth, and I had no intention of looking back. When I stepped out of that dining room, the noise behind me fell away like a door closing on a storm. My heels clicked against the marble hallway, each step steadier than the one before. The air felt different, cooler, cleaner, almost as if the house itself had exhaled after years of holding its breath. I reached the front entrance and paused, my hand resting on the doorknob, letting the silence settle into my bones. For the first time in my life, I wasn't leaving that mansion carrying shame or smallness. I was walking away with the truth in my hands, and that truth felt like freedom. The night air wrapped around me as I stepped outside, and I breathed deeply, letting the cold ground me. Something inside me had shifted, something permanent, something long overdue. The days that followed moved slowly, like the world was giving me space to understand what had just unraveled. I spent the first few mornings at Bright Horizons, before the kids arrived, walking the halls while the sun warmed the big front windows. We'd received an influx of support donors reaching out directly, parents volunteering more hours, local organizations offering help. None of it felt like charity. It felt like recognition. Some things were still uncertain. Investigations would follow, board members would be questioned, changes would have to be made. But for the first time, none of those changes scared me. I wasn't hiding anymore. Restoring the center became part of my healing. Jasmine and I painted the main studio a warm amber rolling fresh color over the scuffs and fingerprints that marked years of hard effort. We replaced the old duct-taped mats with new ones donated quietly by someone who said our work mattered. I spent long afternoons rearranging shelves, cleaning storage rooms, opening windows to let in the early spring breeze. There was something soothing about the physical act of rebuilding each brushstroke, each freshly cleaned corner, each new poster taped to the wall felt like reclaiming a part of myself. I didn't speak to Elaine again. Sources told me she was staying elsewhere, keeping to herself, while the foundation board called emergency meetings. She tried to contact me once, an email full of excuses, not apologies, but I didn't respond. Boundaries didn't need anger to be firm. Sometimes silence was stronger. Richard reached out more than once, but he kept his messages simple. When you're ready to talk, I want to do better. I'm proud of what you're building. I didn't ignore him, but I didn't rush either. Healing wasn't a door I could simply invite him through. It was something we would approach carefully, step by step, if we ever approached it at all. But there was one message that landed differently, a voicemail after he'd visited the center, quietly standing in the doorway, while Liam practiced a small routine with two of his friends. "Thank you for giving him a world where he feels safe," he said. After that, I agreed to meet not as a daughter seeking validation, but as a woman choosing what relationships she allowed in her life. Bright Horizons became even more of a home that spring. Jasmine showed up with cartons of food when I forgot to eat. Parents brought homemade thank you cards from their kids. Neighbors stopped by to help plant flowers along the walkway, turning the entrance into something bright and welcoming. None of it was dramatic. It was kindness in quiet, steady forms, the kind of support I'd learned to build my life around. Liam changed too. He grew surer, braver, louder in the best ways. He helped lead warm-up stretches, challenged his friends to small races, and showed off every new skill with the radiant pride of a boy who finally believed he belonged somewhere. One afternoon, he tugged me toward the window, his face glowing. "Look, Sophie," he said, "Dad's here again." And there was Richard standing outside, hands in his pockets, simply watching, not directing, not controlling, just present. I let Liam run to him first. I waited a few moments before joining them, the breeze tugging lightly at my hair. When I reached them, Richard didn't speak right away. He just nodded, his expression softening. "I want to help," he finally said, without conditions, without taking over. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was humility, something I never imagined I'd see in him. I accepted it for what it was, a beginning, not a fix. By early summer, the new wing of our center opened, funded by grants and community partners, not by a foundation trying to polish its image. We held a small gathering. Nothing fancy, just families and volunteers sharing snacks and laughter under string lights. At one point, I slipped away and stood in the doorway, watching as kids danced, wheeled, and shuffled across the floor. The room buzzed with life, with resilience, with joy. It felt like everything I had fought for, everything I had survived, had finally come full circle. Later that evening, after everyone left, I walked through the quiet studio alone. The lights were dim, the air warm with the scent of fresh paint and pine cleaner. I placed my hand on the smooth railing along the wall, new, sturdy, ready for years of small hands learning to balance. This place had been built from scraps and stubborn hope, and now it stood strong enough to carry more than just me. It carried the stories of every child who walked or rolled through its doors. It carried the truth of who I had become, shaped by hurt, but not defined by it. Outside, the summer sky was a deep shade of blue, the kind that feels endless. I opened the windows and let the evening breeze flow into the room. It brushed across my skin like a quiet promise. Tomorrow we would greet new families. Tomorrow Liam would show up with his laugh that filled every corner. Tomorrow I would continue building the life I chose, not the one I'd been handed. As I stood there watching the curtains sway gently, I understood something I hadn't been able to grasp before. Healing isn't a dramatic moment. It isn't loud. It isn't a single choice or a single victory. It's the quiet decision day after day to keep choosing yourself even when others didn't. And in that still room with the moonlight resting soft on the floor, I felt a steady truth settle deep inside me. Sometimes life doesn't hand you a place to belong. Sometimes you have to build it from the ground up. And when you do, it becomes stronger than anything that ever tried to break you.